unlike everybody else on the call, I was rejected at RSA and not allowed to speak at Syracon, and I've just been sort of placed in the.
Loser.
uh, so but I did do a webinar with XM Cyber on some research we did with them and released recently, and I figured I'd highlight some of that. It's different than uh, risk quantification, tail value at risk, predicting vulnerability exploitation. But at the same time, there's some common themes as well. This notion of how do I cut through the noise and find the signal and focus my remediation on the riskiest things is very much a theme that we hit in this report. So um, one cool thing about this was that it used attack path analysis. I mean, that's what XM Cyber does. We've never worked with a company actually that does attack path analysis. So this was new for us. And if you're not familiar with the concept of attack path analysis, maybe this chart helps. But rather than say finding one single vulnerability that exists in an environment, they're trying to say, all right, I'm an attacker, and I see this, and then that connects me to this, and then that connects me to that, and then that gets me to a critical asset. And they're trying to map out all the little routes through the enterprise to those things and bubble up for their customers which ones ought to be fixed to sort of break the path, right? And the question becomes, which of these are the most important? And we did a little bit of looking at that, and a couple just highlights. Typical organization, we found about 11,000 exposures. An exposure is basically some kind of vulnerable resource and a technique that can exploit it, right? And if you chain those together, then you have a path. So I think a lot of exposure management is treating those exposures as individual things, right? I need to go fix these 11,000 things or some subset of them. But one of the cool things we looked at is maybe we can reduce them by figuring out whether those exposures, those attack paths chain together to get to critical assets. And if they don't, there's a term called dead ends. So 75% of those exposures that I just showed you lead to dead ends. That doesn't mean, ignore them, but it means at least an attacker can't use that to continue the path toward a critical asset, right? So we can kind of delay or deprioritize those. And what we want is to identify those paths that do lead to critical assets. And we come up with something like this, this concept of choke points. So out of all those 11,000 exposures, which are represented by the gray squares here, I believe like 2% of them are considered a choke point, where you have a bunch of paths leading in to some exposed resource that leads to a critical asset. The idea being that, all right, if I can remediate whatever that is, I break a bunch of paths all at once, and therefore it's an efficient way to go about remediation. And this is a theme again that we've seen a lot when you use the proportion of CVEs that are exploited. You cut way down to single digit percents that you really get priority remediation. We kind of found the same trend here, right? And anytime we see that, I think it's pretty cool. The other one thing I'll highlight here is that not only the sort of proportion, but we were able to measure the length of those paths, which kind of surprised me. So within one hop, meaning the attacker is in the environment, and within one step, one movement from whatever that point is, they can reach over half of all critical assets in the environment in one hop. And by 4 hops, they can get to over 80% of exposures in the environment. And if you read the report, we kind of compare on-prem and cloud. Attack paths tend to be longer on-prem and surprisingly short on-prem. For instance, I think within one hop from the initial access point in a cloud environment, you get to 90% of critical assets in the cloud instead of taking 4 hops to get to 80% on-prem. So if you like that kind of stuff, there's lots of juicy tidbits and stats in this report if you would like to check it out. And there is a webinar And I'm sure we'll give you some links to both of those resources.
Hey, Wade, there was a question online here,
Ah.
and it says, are the paths described by attack or another method?
So XM Cyber sort of has their own way of referring to these, but they do have them mapped to MITRE ATT&CK. And I don't believe, Jade, in the report, did we give the attack? We did not give the attack version, did we? I don't
think we
so.
did. No.
And I think, in fact, I think we sort of put all these specific techniques in the appendix, and we just did things like, hey, 80% of these involve something related to identity and access management. So we tried to give broad groupings on these things, but short answer, yes, they do have that, and they have reported on that in the past. We did not get super deep into exactly what is this technique in this particular report.
Yeah. Good.